Welcome to the CSR Box Impact Talk series. I am Sharvari Parikh from Team CSR Box. In today's session, we are going to talk about one of the most pressing issues that the entire world is facing today: climate change and its associated impact on business, economy, trade, and social infrastructure is quite evident. In this regard, we are witnessing organizations, associations, and individuals who have started adopting sustainable business strategies and are also promoting climate friendly practices. In today's session, we have Mr. Samir Sishodia, CEO at Rainmatter Foundation. Mr. Samir heads the Rainmatter Foundation since late 2020 when it was founded. His concern around food system, climate change, and biodiversity collapse has led him further and further away from his earlier tech avatar. He also runs a small locally focused travel outfit brand, has created regenerative farming collectives, and at Rainmatter Foundation, he's now trying to figure out ways on how to create mainstream change to try and address the most critical issues that species have ever faced. We welcome to you, Mr. Samir Sisodia, for the CSR Box Impact Talk series. Thank you for your time on having us on board with us today. So, to begin with, talking about the climate change in Indian context, we know that India has announced to achieve the net zero emission target by 2017, which is a rather ambitious deadline. So, given this aim, how do you think the momentum is building around the climate change adaptation and mitigation in country? And as an organization in the forefront in the space of climate change, how do you think we are faring on this front?
Yeah, hi. Thanks for having me over. Pleasure to be here. It's a very important discussion to have, and the question you raised around the net zero impact, the net zero targets that the world is chasing. I think in the last year, it's starting to become clear that we do not have time to start addressing to this crisis. It's not just India's issue or India's problem, but one is to just look at it from a offset and a net zero lens is not going to be sufficient. And the other one is that just to look at the energy and mobility transitions as the answer to this is not going to be the solution. It is a problem that intersects with almost every aspect of our lives, right? The materials we use, the choices we make in our economies, the length of the supply chains, the way we do our production, the levels of consumption, our food systems, where we source our water from, and so on and so forth. I think we have to look at the construct of everything we have assembled on the back of abundant energy in the last 100 years and start making adjustments right away, both to adapt, but in the medium and long term to also make all of these convenience and choices a lot more energy efficient, a lot more energy hungry.
Right. So, since you already talked about the consumption pattern for India, which is, one of the developing countries that we currently are. So, obviously, the consumption patterns vary when we are talking about developed countries and developing countries. So, India being still a developing country, how do you actually think can we strike a balance between economic growth and climate change? With mitigation efforts requiring significant change in energy consumption patterns, because as a developing country we equally have to think about growth with sustainability. So how do you think can a developing country like India have a balanced approach in this regard?
I would change that question a little bit. Yes, we do have to think about the well-being of our populations. We have to think about a variety of different parameters on health, nutrition, livelihoods, income, because those are the things that matter to people on a real everyday basis, right? So those are parameters through which we have to look at the climate lens through. But is growth as we have imagined it in the last few decades the only answer? Because honestly, in the Indian context, it has not been growth for 95% of the population. For 95% of the places, if you're seeing maybe a inflation adjusted income growth of 10-15%, but if you're seeing an asset loss of 80%, soil carbon is down, water tables are down. This year, we are very likely to have a little bit of a food crisis.
Yeah.
Health and nutrition numbers are not looking great. Rural India has something called lean diabetes today. lifestyle diseases are prevalent across rural India, which is scary. Um, the scene in urban India already with respect to health and air quality and so on and so forth. Right. So, what are the wins that we're talking about? Right. So, I think we have to imagine wins across all these parameters and then start looking at through climate, but not get fixated on growth as we have imagined it in the last 40, 50, 70 years, because it's not really been growth for most people. It's not been growth on most parameters. We've actually had measurable losses on this. Delhi's air quality and the um, levels of asthma and the reduction in lifespan of Delhi's kids, I wouldn't put it in the growth bucket at all. Right. So we have to look at some of these parameters more seriously and really think of pathways. And India has a great opportunity to invent these pathways because we are not locked in to methods and solutions that a large part of the developed world is locked into. So can we invent differently? Can we chase better measures that really bring wins to all of us?
Right. Um, uh, Now that we are talking about, how climate change is also affecting majority of the population, with certain regions being very much, having intense effect. So, given the magnitude of India's population, what do you think? Which communities and particularly regions, if we talk about, are more vulnerable to the impacts of climate change? And also, to what extent are some of these challenges this community or regions will be facing in order to adapt to these changes? So if you can, throw a light on that. Yeah.
So I was saying there are three ways to answer this question. One is that across the world, now it's starting to get realized that no part of the world is going to escape the impacts of climate change. Right? Europe is starting to see food stresses. Europe is starting to see a higher growth in temperature compared to the rest of the world. And the imagination was that the third world would be hit next. Even in India, we've seen deficit rainfall and excessive rainfall happening at the same time. We're seeing reports of flooding from across the country, and at the same time, we're seeing reports of crop losses, both from flooding and from water deficit. So every part of the country, every part of the world actually has to start accounting for it, adapting to it, preparing for this in their own ways, right, in their own unique context. I don't think it's a question of these are the five geographies that are more vulnerable and major, because especially in a globalized world that we are coming from, supply chains carry your food from across places, right? So huge impact in one part of the country will have fallouts in other parts of the country. The second part is that yes, there are sections of society that will have to bear the impact more. Right, the way our social structures are, there are groups with less economic ability, and today, unfortunately, also disconnected from their land or they, with the lack of agency, with uh, lesser ability to actually respond to this in a local context, because we've eroded that capacity in the last few decades. By provisioning for it externally too much, we've actually reduced the capacity in the local system and local governance to actually respond to this. It is not just a question of economic ability. It's a question of gender, it's a question of caste, but it's also a question of local knowledge and local ability to respond to small things. For instance, a lot of communities have, the breadth of production systems has reduced to a few commodities and a few food grains. So it's scary to hear that farming communities have a nutrition problem and sometimes even a lack of food, because they're doing the cash crops, and if the cash crop fails for one reason or the other, they don't have access to food. Right? If you really think of it, it's an absurd situation. It should have never happened.
Right.
Similarly, there are issues around preparedness from structured and governance points of view. So I would say our cities are actually in some sense way more vulnerable because they are very fragile and dependent on long supply chains, on services being provided. As we saw in COVID, just having access to money doesn't always give you access to all that you need. Right. So I think it's interesting how this is bringing out the fragility in many of our systems increasingly. I think the last bit on this is around the really vulnerable thing, and the thing we have compromised the most is the non-human parts of the planet. We are seeing an extinction rate of between 100 and 200 species a day, depending on who you ask. And the unborn. We are really compromising the planet and our places for the future generations. Right. So, in my opinion, in a sense, those are the most vulnerable.
Right. So I think you've already covered the next question that I was going to pose, the social economic consequences of the climate change. I think you already covered that. But you also talked about how, certain segments, particularly cities, are more fragile to climate change. And in this regard, we have also been witnessing climate change induced migration in certain parts of the country. So, what do you think? What steps can be taken to ensure more dignified and climate resilient resettlement for these migrants? Because this is something which cannot be controlled. But at least from the governance point of view, what we can do is we can make sure of more structured or dignified approach to this.
So I was saying there is a certain problem in the view that as the climate crisis expands and starts to hit and sectors, that we will be able to create this kind of support at scale, because both the populations and the places that need that support are going to be massive, and the ability to actually create that support is going to shrink. Right? I mean, if you have a flood in one part of the country, other parts of the country, whether it's citizens or governments, can pitch in. But if this is happening in a dozen parts of the country simultaneously, and followed by a drought, and followed by a flood again, and followed by some other crisis on a continuous basis, I think our ability to respond to it and to account for it will also continuously shrink. So it's important that we build resilience and capacity in our places. And that's really the problem. We have neglected our places. We have neglected our own wards, our own panchayats, our own towns, our own cities. We do not recognize the capacities there. We do not recognize the natural systems there. We do not build around it. Our consumption doesn't come from it. So there's this term called bioregionalism. I think understanding, living with, creating around, and respecting your place in that sense. Right. If we do not care for and account for our places everywhere, you get the planetary problem. That's what's happened to the planet as a whole. So I think this rebuilding will have to happen largely in a local context, right? With that, what you'll see is you will start creating a lot of capacity everywhere to help your neighbors.
Right.
And that's really the answer to both adaptation and to long-term mitigation on this.
Right. So since you talked about capacity building at individual level, now we already know that the magnitude of population that India has, being one of the most populated country in the world today. So do you think that we can leverage this population through in a way that we can harness public awareness and individual actions that can be, be helpful for effective mobilization to make more meaningful impact on climate change mitigation? Probably that can act as an anchor to probably a domino effect, that if we do capacity building of a particular group or individual, that can ultimately help leverage other people as well.
Yeah, I think we just have to be smart about it, whether it's natural resources or human resources in terms of number of people. We have abundance,
Yeah.
right? Can we use this abundance now to build for the crisis that's coming in a few years or a few decades' time? Actually, it's a few years, not a few decades anymore. For instance, I mean, if you have to move out of the energy transition, out of the energy consumption on fossil fuels, etc., one is to chase renewables. But we have a lot of people. Can we build our systems around people? Because we are trying to create livelihoods in any case.
Hmm.
If we talk about it in terms of monetary efficiency, I mean, what is that efficiency worth if it's not working for 90% of the population?
Right.
Right? I mean, what are you measuring efficiency in terms of?
Hmm.
Right? So can we create systems and responses which actually make use of our resources, make use of our people, work for the people, make it much, much more energy efficient? As an example, I keep saying that, Eastern UP, for instance, still has water at 25 feet.
Hmm. Yeah.
As the glaciers start to melt, you will see flooding earlier, but you will also see this water drop to levels that the place has never faced.
Yeah. Hmm.
Right? If you use your human resources and build capacity to work for this coming change, build agricultural systems and food systems that can adapt to this now,
Hmm.
right? Which can build around your technologies, around your soil, around your methods, you will not have to migrate.
Hmm.
Otherwise, the planet is going to see the largest migration that it has ever seen, the
Yeah.
largest human migration that it has ever seen.
Hmm.
So,
Right. Um, and specifically when you talked about integration of technology into climate mitigation practices, and you yourself coming from technology background, so I really had this question in my mind regarding how what role do you think technology and innovation can play in supporting climate change mitigation adaptation, particularly in India and globally, if you may be, or also, are you incorporating any such strategies at Rainmatter Foundation, or have you witnessed organizations, businesses integrating technology into climate mitigation practices?
yes and no. So, I think, again, when we speak in terms of technology, there are two views of it. Um, One is how we have been seeing technology and innovation in the last, let's say, 3 or 4 decades, right? From the software and the digital tech view. And that has a role to play in making sure uh, information and knowledge dissemination of the right methods of what works everywhere are available at scale. And it's not something we have done. We have actually depleted the knowledge that existed everywhere, right? And switched it for fewer pockets of knowledge that we have actually made available. Um, you know, it's also gotten concentrated in a few pockets. The value from that has concentrated in a few pockets, and so on and so forth. Part of the technology that we need uh, existed as wisdom out there, as traditional knowledge. Part of it is going to come from research and innovation. But what we really need is ways, including technology ways, uh, to mainstream this knowledge and this action that we need for change. Because today, the action and innovation and use of technology, all of this is limited to very tiny pockets.
Right.
Right? There's been a concentration of all of this, like a small lab in a city innovates, and everybody else just consumes out of it. We
Yeah.
need a reversal of that trend.
Right.
And we are actually trying to create a platform where any change maker anywhere around their resources, around their skills, is able to uh, access help, access know-how, access finance, access help, and be able to create that change in their context.
Right. Right. So, a very important point that you raised here was also equally considering the traditional practices. while we are talking about climate change mitigation. So again, focusing on that, the role that policymakers can actually play in imbibing these indigenous practices and local knowledge into the action for climate change policies that can actually help in more adaptive and effective ways of mitigation amongst the community. So how do you think, can policymakers play an important role in imbibing all of this?
Policy has to flex. I mean, it's not just policy really. It's policy, it's philanthropic change making, it's change making by CSOs, by innovators, by industry. We've over the last few decades, we've seen more and more centralization.
Yeah.
Right? What we are calling globalization today is
Mhm.
also the centralization of production, of IP, of knowledge, and it's push as a consumer product to larger and larger audiences further and further away.
Right.
Right? We've come across instances where a village consumes 80 or 90% of its daily needs from somewhere else. Right? Even vegetables. It's amazing how much vegetable rural India is buying from a city trade. Right?
Right.
Which is a very absurd proposition if you think of it.
Mm.
It represents an economic loss, but it also represents a loss in terms of the carbon footprint incurred on this, in terms of the diversity at the farm or in the village you could have had if you were doing more diverse production and so on and so forth. Right. So I think allowing for a lot of locally led solutions, locally led problem definitions, locally led innovation that suits their context. I mean, if you are in a bamboo growing region, your furniture, a lot of your products, a lot of your needs can be met using bamboo. The technology for it or the ideas for it probably existed somewhere in your past.
Mm.
There's a need to do a lot more R&D on them, take them to the next level and so on and so forth. But at the core, a lot of those ideas did exist. Right? There were regions which were rice eating regions, rice growing regions.
Yeah.
There were regions which were eating millets.
Mm.
Forcing rice on everybody was a problem, and forcing millets on the rice growing regions will be a problem as well. So there's a logical context to where you live. There's a geographical context to where you live.
Yeah.
And if your innovation, science, technology, eating habits, everything is built around that, that's just more efficient. And we've got to get to that efficiency. So which means policy, change making, philanthropy, all of this has to allow for that flexibility for these solutions to come ground up, to be discovered ground up, and to be played out in the context that it revolves in.
Right, right. So I think you've largely covered how different stakeholders can play an important role in this regard. And this actually brings me to my last question to you, which is, after 75 years of independence, what do you think should be the road ahead for India? And in this regard, what would be your vision for India at 2047? I know we already talked about the net zero target that India has for 2070. But if you look at the, probably near term or short term target, what would you think that would be for India in terms of climate change?
2047 is really far away from how 22 and 23 have gone. I was of the view that we had maybe 30 years to do this. But now I think we have to make these changes in the next decade.
Yeah.
We have to own our places. We have to care about our places. We have to believe in the capacity and the resources and the production systems and the knowledge that our places had. If we don't believe in our places will not be able to support us. Then we believe in, like I keep joking that if you don't believe in your biology, you believe in somebody else's mining. And more of our answers are coming from somebody else's mining and not from our biology and our ecology.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's a fundamental break, not just in India, across the planet that we've seen. We don't believe in our places anymore. We don't trust our surroundings and our biology anymore for anything that we need of it. So I think that reconnection needs to be established, because that's the reconnection that we're talking about when we talk about, being custodians of our planet. It begins at your place, at your home. If you don't own your home, I can't really fix your home.
Mm-hmm.
right? So I think that's a major fundamental shift we need to see. Like, thankfully, in India, we have large indigenous populations and communities, which still retain a lot of it, not 100%. We need to build on that. We need to build on a lot of these core instincts that we did have at some point of time. India is a very, very diverse and vibrant country. It's naturally blessed with diversity of flora, fauna. You know, we whenever we've given nature a chance, it's sprung back to life. And if we learn how to live with it and build around it, I think we can almost lead the way for the world on how to live with the planet and not in battle mode with it. Right. So I think in the next, hopefully, dozen years, we'll invent or reinvent ways of doing this, using new technology, using traditions, using new frame of thinking, as opposed to the one we've been using for the last 40, 50 years, and set an example that maybe the world can follow.
Right. So I think summing up what you said, if every individual does their job, we are, even if they do their bit, I think we would be on the right path to what we want to achieve in near future. So I think the big
Absolutely.
change is something that we are looking at here.
Absolutely. Everybody's got to start making 5 better trade-offs on a daily basis.
Right.
Whether it's, like I said, if you have to go buy groceries and you use biology more than mining, if you walk instead of taking your car out for the 200 meters you need to go, you've made a better trade-off. And 5 such better trade-offs into 8 billion people across the planet, I think we'll start to get somewhere.
Right, right. So at individual level, it might seem as a negligible contribution, but if you see at the larger picture, it actually adds up to a significant amount of change that we are visioning at.
Also at every level, right? Like whether you're a bureaucrat or a minister heading a major ministry, you are an individual. So at every level, we need individuals to kick in and start thinking of this and making this change.
Absolutely.
Irrespective of who you are.
Yeah, yeah. So I think this concludes our talk. But if you have any points that I would have missed out, any questions that I might have not raised, but if you feel that you want to add something for our audience that might help us going forward. So
in all my public talks and interactions, I do try to address the younger audience, anybody who's below 30, but 26 more specifically. One is because I think our generation needs to apologize to anybody who's younger, because the set of choices, the set of measures, the set of tools, aspirations that we have created and left behind for them is not very great, right? And our generation needs to take more. It needs to acknowledge it more. It needs to take more responsibility for at least trying to change the narrative. The tools will follow. And the second thing is, I think the younger folks are what I call ecological natives. They have grown up with these questions. They have grown up with these considerations and thoughts in their head. And I think there is hope there that the ecological natives will actually find a lot more answers than anybody in our generation was able to. I hope we start including many more younger people in this problem solving, because people from my generation and older, there is a certain locking into a certain set of ideas, measures, what we value, and so on and so forth. So this idea of growth that you mentioned early on, for instance, is still a hangover from the 80s.
Yeah.
You're chasing growth as your only target and not well-being and not the outcomes you wanted from growth.
Right, right.
I think we need to start moving away from some of those frames.
Right, right. So I think at the larger level, the focus should be more on well-being rather than just growth. And I think what you rightly raised was each generation we have been facing, different challenges, and the future generation for them, they will have a different set of problems that they will have to be trained on. So I think that is something very important, and this will set the standard for all our climate practitioners. And at organization level, we have the road ahead, that what should be done in order to address the upcoming challenges. So that was really helpful, actually, and I'm sure this will help our audience and upcoming generations. Surely, the message that you shared for them. So thank you once again for your contribution for our climate practitioners today and tomorrow. Thank you again
Thank you so
from the
much.
Team CSR Box.
Bye bye.
Thank you. Bye.